The wind howled across the Wyoming territory like a wounded animal, carrying snow so thick it seemed the very sky had torn open and spilled its white innards across the frozen earth. Eleanor Morrison pressed herself deeper into the meager shelter of the train station's overhang, her thin wool coat doing little to ward off the bitter cold that seeped through every thread, every fiber of her being. Her fingers, once steady enough to thread the finest surgical needle, now trembled uncontrollably as she clutched the small leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. The last train had departed 3 hours ago, its whistle fading into the storm like a ghost's final cry. The station master had locked up and gone home to his warm hearth, leaving her alone with nothing but the howling wind and her own desperate thoughts. Eleanor's breath came in short puffs that crystallized instantly in the frigid air, each exhale a small surrender to the cold that crept steadily through her bones. She had been traveling for 6 days, her meager savings dwindling with each mile that carried her further from Boston and the scandal that had destroyed everything she had worked for. The accusations still rang in her ears, whispered words that had followed her through hospital corridors and drawing rooms alike. Negligence, they had called it, improper conduct. The death of Senator Morrison's wife had needed someone to blame, and Eleanor, with her unconventional methods and lack of family connections, had been the perfect sacrifice. As I tell this story of survival against impossible odds, I find myself wondering where in the world you might be listening from right now. Are you somewhere warm, perhaps by a fire? Or are you facing your own winter storms? I'd love to know what time it is in your corner of the world and what's keeping you company during this tale. The memory of that final day haunted her still. She had done everything right, followed every protocol, but Mrs. Morrison had been beyond saving from the moment she arrived at the hospital. The infection had spread too far, the fever too high. Yet when the senator needed someone to bear the weight of his grief and rage, Eleanor's steady hands and gentle voice had counted for nothing against his political influence and social standing. Now she found herself stranded in this godforsaken outpost, with barely enough money for a meal and nowhere to spend the night. The cold was becoming dangerous. She could feel her thoughts growing sluggish, her movements more labored. Hypothermia was setting in, and with her medical training, she knew exactly what that meant. She had perhaps an hour before her body would begin shutting down, maybe less in this brutal wind. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the storm's roar, steady and strong despite the treacherous conditions. Eleanor lifted her head, squinting through the swirling snow as a large figure on horseback materialized from the white darkness. The rider sat tall in his saddle, seemingly unbothered by the storm that threatened to tear lesser men from their mounts. As he drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a man wrapped in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. Samuel Cartwright had been riding these ranges for 15 years, and he knew the signs of a killing storm when he saw one. He had been checking on his northern herds when the weather turned, and now he was racing against time to reach the shelter of his ranch. The train station appeared through the snow like a beacon, its familiar outline promising temporary refuge from the wind's fury. But as he approached, something made him pull up short. There, huddled against the building like a broken bird, was a figure in dark clothing. His heart clenched as he realized what he was seeing. Someone was stranded here, alone and exposed to the storm that could kill a person in minutes. Without hesitation, Sam dismounted and strode toward the figure, his boots crunching through the deepening snow. Eleanor heard the footsteps and tried to stand, but her legs would no longer support her properly. She looked up to see a tall man approaching, his face shadowed beneath his hat brim. He knelt beside her without a word, and she caught a glimpse of dark eyes filled with concern rather than judgment. His presence seemed to block some of the wind's bite, offering the first comfort she had felt in hours. "You need to get warm," he said, his voice deep and steady despite the storm's chaos. His hands were gentle as he helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her knees threatened to buckle. "Can you ride?" Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't certain she could manage it. The man's strength seemed limitless as he lifted her onto his horse with careful efficiency, then swung up behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and she felt the blessed warmth of his body through their heavy coats. The horse responded to his commands with sure-footed confidence, carrying them into the storm toward whatever salvation lay ahead. As they rode through the howling darkness, Eleanor felt consciousness slipping away from her like water through her fingers. The last thing she remembered was the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the protective warmth of the stranger's embrace, carrying her away from the station where she might have died forgotten and alone. The storm raged on around them, But for the first time in months, Eleanor Morrison felt safe. The warmth hit Eleanor like a physical blow as they crossed the threshold of what seemed to be the largest ranch house she had ever seen. Samuel carried her inside with the same careful strength he had shown at the station, his boots echoing against polished hardwood floors that spoke of wealth beyond anything she had imagined. The interior blazed with the light of countless oil lamps, their golden glow reflecting off rich mahogany furniture and walls lined with leather-bound books. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth crackling with a fire that seemed to reach out and embrace her with its blessed heat. Samuel lowered her gently onto a leather sofa positioned near the flames, then disappeared without a word. Eleanor found herself alone in luxury that felt almost sinful after her weeks of poverty and desperation. The house around her whispered of success and refinement. Carved wooden figurines decorated the mantelpiece, their intricate details speaking of patient craftsmanship. Heavy woolen rugs covered the floors in patterns of deep red and gold, and the furniture bore the solid construction of pieces built to last generations. This was not the rough cabin she had expected from a Western rancher, but something approaching a mansion. Samuel returned carrying an armload of blankets and a steaming cup that sent aromatic steam curling into the warm air. "Hot coffee," he said simply, settling the cup into her still trembling hands. The ceramic felt wonderful against her palms, and she wrapped her fingers around it gratefully. "Drink slowly. Your body needs time to adjust." His voice carried an educated cadence that surprised her. This was no rough cowboy, despite his weathered appearance and the confident way he moved through the wilderness. Eleanor sipped the coffee carefully, feeling its warmth spread through her chest like liquid sunlight. The taste was rich and complex, better than anything she had enjoyed even in Boston's finest establishments. "You saved my life," Eleanor managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed inadequate for what he had done, plucking her from certain death and bringing her to this sanctuary of warmth and safety. Samuel studied her face in the firelight, noting the delicate bone structure beneath skin pale with cold and exhaustion. She possessed a quiet dignity even in her desperate state, something in her bearing that spoke of education and refinement. Her dark hair had escaped its pins during their ride, framing features that would be lovely once color returned to her cheeks. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her. His manner was respectful, giving her space while remaining close enough to help if needed. "Eleanor Morrison," she replied, then hesitated. She had been using her maiden name since fleeing Boston, hoping to escape the scandal that had destroyed her reputation. "I'm a nurse." Was a nurse. The bitterness in her voice spoke of recent wounds, and Samuel recognized the tone of someone who had lost everything. He had heard it in his own voice years ago, when he was nothing but a ranch hand with impossible dreams and empty pockets. Now he owned more land than some eastern states, but he remembered the taste of desperation. "You're safe here," he said simply. "The storm will pass in a day or two, then we'll figure out what comes next." Eleanor looked around the magnificent room, feeling overwhelmed by both his kindness and the obvious wealth surrounding her. She was a woman alone, dependent on a stranger's charity, with nothing to offer in return for his generosity. The social impropriety of the situation would have scandalized Boston society. But here in the wilderness, survival mattered more than convention. "I have no money to pay you," she admitted, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I can work, though. I know medicine, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." Samuel watched the pride and determination warring with desperation in her expression. There was steel beneath her delicate exterior, a strength that had carried her across the continent despite whatever had driven her from her previous life. He found himself curious about her story, about what had brought a refined Eastern nurse to a remote Wyoming train station with winter closing in. "We'll talk about it when you're stronger," he said. "For now, just rest. Mrs. Henderson will have a room ready for you upstairs, and she'll bring you whatever you need." As if summoned by his words, an older woman appeared in the doorway, her gray hair pinned severely back and her expression kind but no-nonsense. Eleanor recognized the type immediately, a housekeeper who ruled her domain with absolute authority and fierce protectiveness of those under her care. "Come along, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying the soft burr of Scotland. "Let's get you into some dry clothes and a proper bed. You look ready to fall over where you sit." Eleanor rose unsteadily, her legs still weak from cold and exhaustion. Samuel stepped forward as if to help, then stopped himself, respecting her obvious need to maintain what dignity she could. She appreciated his restraint even as part of her longed for the strength of his support. "Thank you," she said again, the words directed to both of them. "I won't forget this kindness." As Mrs. Henderson led her toward the stairs, Eleanor caught one last glimpse of Samuel standing by the fire. The flames cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful expression in his dark eyes. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from success hard-won and carefully maintained. The last thing she saw before Mrs. Henderson guided her upstairs was Samuel staring into the fire, lost in thoughts she could only guess at. Tomorrow would bring questions and decisions she wasn't ready to face. But tonight she was warm and safe and alive. It was more than she had dared hope for when the storm had trapped her at that desolate station. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through windows framed by curtains of deep burgundy velvet. For a moment, she lay still in the magnificent four-poster bed, disoriented by the luxury surrounding her. The mattress beneath her was softer than anything she had known, piled high with quilts that seemed to embrace her with their warmth. The events of the previous night came flooding back, and with them the reality of her situation. She was a stranger in this house, dependent on Samuel Cartwright's charity with nothing to offer but her medical skills and willingness to work. The scandal that had driven her from Boston felt like a weight pressing against her chest, a constant reminder of how quickly a person's life could crumble. Yet as she looked around the beautifully appointed room, she felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Henderson entered carrying a tray that released the most wonderful aromas Eleanor had smelled in weeks. Fresh bread, bacon, eggs, and coffee that rivaled what Samuel had given her the night before. The older woman set the tray on a small table by the window and turned to study Eleanor with shrewd eyes. "You're looking better already," Mrs. Henderson observed, her Scottish accent adding warmth to the words. "Colors coming back to your cheeks. That was a close thing last night, from what Mr. Samuel told me." Eleanor sat up slowly, still feeling the effects of her ordeal. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, noticing that the light seemed too bright for early morning. "Past noon," Mrs. Henderson replied matter-of-factly. "Your body needed the rest. Mr. Samuel said not to wake you until you stirred on your own. He's been out checking on the cattle since dawn, making sure they weathered the storm safely." The mention of Samuel brought a flutter of nervousness to Eleanor's stomach. She owed him her life, yet she knew nothing about the man who had rescued her. His wealth was obvious, but there was something else about him, a quality of careful control that spoke of deeper complexities. She wondered what had motivated him to risk the storm to save a stranger. Mrs. Henderson seemed to read her thoughts. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "Found me when I had nowhere to go. Gave me a home and purpose when the world had written me off as too old to be useful. He doesn't turn away from people in need, never has." Eleanor absorbed this information while Mrs. Henderson bustled about the room, laying out clothes that appeared to be of fine quality despite their practical nature. A riding skirt of deep blue wool, a white blouse with pearl buttons, and undergarments that looked expensive enough to feed a family for weeks. "These belonged to his sister," Mrs. Henderson explained, noting Eleanor's questioning look. "She lived here before she married and moved to California. Similar size to you, I'd say. Mr. Samuel thought you might need something proper to wear." The kindness overwhelmed Eleanor. She had grown accustomed to suspicion and judgment, to doors closing and opportunities vanishing the moment her name was mentioned. This generosity from strangers felt almost too good to be real, as if she might wake to find herself back at that frozen train station. After Mrs. Henderson left, Eleanor dressed carefully in the borrowed clothes. They fit remarkably well, the fabric soft against skin still tender from cold. She braided her hair and pinned it back severely, wanting to appear as respectable as possible when she faced Samuel again. Whatever happened next, she was determined to meet it with dignity and tact. She found him in what appeared to be a study, seated behind a massive oak desk covered with papers and ledgers. The room reflected the same careful attention to quality she had noticed throughout the house. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines speaking of literature, philosophy, and science. This was clearly the retreat of an educated man, someone who valued knowledge as much as success. Samuel looked up as she entered, and she caught a flicker of something in his dark eyes before his expression settled into polite concern. The borrowed clothes transformed her appearance, revealing the refined bearing that exhaustion and desperation had previously hidden. She was lovely, he realized, with the kind of understated elegance that came from good breeding and education. "You're feeling better," he observed, rising from his chair with the easy grace that seemed natural to him. "Mrs. Henderson says you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Eleanor admitted. The honesty surprised her. She had grown so accustomed to guarding her words, to revealing nothing that might be used against her. But something about Samuel invited truth, a quality of patient listening that made her want to trust him. They stood facing each other across the study, both aware of the questions that hung unspoken between them. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, preparing to explain herself, to justify her presence in his home and perhaps earn her continued sanctuary. But Samuel spoke first, his voice gentle despite the serious nature of his words. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share," he said. "But I want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is what happens next." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though she fought to contain them. When had anyone last shown her such uncomplicated kindness? The weight of secrets and shame she had been carrying seemed to lighten slightly, as if his words had given her permission to set down her burden, at least temporarily. "I was accused of medical negligence," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "The patient died, someone important, and they needed someone to blame. I lost my position, my reputation, everything I had worked for. I came west because there was nowhere else to go." Samuel nodded slowly, his expression unchanged by her revelation. He had suspected something of the sort, recognizing in her the particular desperation of someone whose professional life had been destroyed through no fault of their own. He had seen it before, in the territories where people came to reinvent themselves far from the judgment of civilized society. "Can you still practice medicine?" he asked simply. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the practical nature of his question. She had expected shock, perhaps disgust, certainly the kind of moral judgment that had followed her across the continent. Instead, Samuel seemed interested only in her capabilities, not the scandal that had driven her from them. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I know my profession. I'm good at it, despite what they said. I just need a chance to prove it again." Samuel smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "Then we'll find you that chance," he said. "This territory needs good medical care, and I have a feeling you're exactly what we've been waiting for." The opportunity to prove herself came sooner than Eleanor had dared hope. 3 days after the storm, as she was helping Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen and learning the rhythms of ranch life, urgent hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Through the window, Eleanor watched a young cowboy slide from his lathered horse and stumble toward the house, his face twisted with panic. "Mr. Samuel," he called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "It's Tom Henderson's boy, gored by a bull down at the south pasture. He's bleeding something fierce, and we can't get it stopped." Samuel appeared from the barn, his expression immediately shifting to the focused intensity Eleanor was beginning to recognize. "Where is he now?" he demanded, already moving toward his horse. "Cookie's got him in the bunkhouse," the cowboy replied. "But Mr. Samuel, I don't think he's going to make it. There's so much blood, and the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride in good weather." Eleanor felt her medical training surge to the forefront, overriding months of self-doubt and shame. She stepped out onto the porch, her voice clear and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I can help," she said. "I'm a trained nurse. If you have medical supplies, I might be able to save him." Samuel turned to her, and she saw something shift in his dark eyes. This was no longer about charity or kindness. This was about life and death, and she was offering skills that could make the difference. Without hesitation, he nodded. "Mrs. Henderson, gather whatever medical supplies we have. Eleanor, can you ride?" Minutes later, they were racing across the snow-covered range toward the cluster of buildings that housed Samuel's ranch hands. Eleanor clung to the saddle of a gentle mare, her borrowed skirts tucked as modestly as possible around her legs. The wind whipped at her face, but she felt more alive than she had in months. For the first time since Boston, someone needed her medical expertise without question or suspicion. The bunkhouse was chaos when they arrived. A young man, barely out of his teens, lay on a narrow cot surrounded by grim-faced cowboys who stepped back as Eleanor entered. Blood had soaked through makeshift bandages, and she could see immediately that the bull's horn had torn a deep gash across the boy's abdomen. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale with shock. Eleanor's training took over completely. She knelt beside the cot, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed the wound. The bleeding was severe but not arterial. If she could clean and suture the laceration properly, the boy had a chance. She looked up at Samuel, who stood watching her with an expression of complete trust. "I need clean water," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "Boiling hot. And I'll need someone to hold him still while I work. This is going to hurt, but if I don't close this wound properly, he'll bleed to death." Samuel immediately began organizing the men, sending some for water and supplies while positioning others to assist. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for his unquestioning support. In Boston, she had often faced skepticism from male colleagues who questioned her every decision. Here, faced with a crisis, Samuel simply trusted her expertise. The next hour tested every skill Eleanor possessed. Working by lamplight in the crude surroundings of the bunkhouse, she cleaned the wound with meticulous care, removing debris and damaged tissue. Her hands remained steady as she sutured the torn flesh, using techniques she had learned in the charity hospitals where she had trained before entering private practice. The boy, whose name was Danny, drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked. During his lucid moments, she spoke to him softly, explaining what she was doing and reassuring him that he would recover. Samuel held the lamp steady throughout the procedure, never flinching even when the work became particularly difficult. When Eleanor finally tied off the last suture and bandaged the wound with clean cloth, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She had forgotten how demanding emergency medicine could be, how it required every ounce of concentration and skill. But as she looked down at Danny's now peaceful face, his breathing steady and his color improving, she felt a satisfaction she had not experienced since leaving Boston. "Will he live?" Samuel asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern for the young man who worked for him. "If infection doesn't set in." "Yes," Eleanor replied, washing blood from her hands in a basin of warm water. "He'll need careful nursing for the next few days, and the wound will have to be watched closely. But he's young and strong. He should heal well." The cowboys who had witnessed her work looked at her with something approaching awe. They had seen death from accident and violence many times, had watched men die from wounds less severe than Danny's. What Eleanor had accomplished seemed almost miraculous to their eyes. Samuel walked her back to the main house as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with shared purpose rather than awkward uncertainty. Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in months. Professional pride restored. "You saved his life," Samuel said as they reached the porch. "The way you worked in there, the skill you showed, that boy owes you everything." Eleanor paused at the door, looking back at the bunkhouse where Danny lay recovering. "I had forgotten what it felt like," she admitted, "to be trusted with someone's life, to use my training to actually help people." In Boston, toward the end, everything became about politics and social standing. "I lost sight of why I became a nurse in the first place." Samuel studied her face in the fading light, seeing the transformation that had occurred during the crisis. The uncertain, desperate woman he had rescued from the train station was gone, replaced by someone confident in her abilities and secure in her purpose. This was who Eleanor Morrison truly was beneath the scandal and shame that had driven her west. "Maybe that's why you ended up here," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe everything that happened was meant to bring you to a place where your skills could do the most good. Out here, we don't care about Boston society or Eastern politics. We care about results, about people who can do what needs doing when it matters most." Eleanor felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she could see a future that held purpose and meaning. Perhaps Samuel was right. Perhaps losing everything in Boston had been the price she had to pay to find where she truly belonged. As they entered the warm house, Mrs. Henderson bustling forward with hot coffee and worried questions about Danny's condition, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just a refugee seeking shelter from scandal. She was a medical professional whose skills were needed and valued. More importantly, she was beginning to feel like she might actually have found a home. Word of Eleanor's success with Danny Henderson spread through the territory like wildfire across dry grass. Within a week, riders began appearing at Samuel's ranch seeking the mysterious Eastern nurse who could work miracles with needle and thread. A rancher's wife suffering from a difficult pregnancy, a child with a fever that wouldn't break, an old prospector with a persistent cough that had the entire mining camp worried about consumption. Eleanor found herself busier than she had ever been in Boston, treating patients in the ranch house parlor that Samuel had converted into a makeshift medical office. He had ridden to town and returned with supplies that must have cost a fortune. Surgical instruments, medicines, bandages, and books on the latest medical techniques. When she protested the expense, he simply said that tools were worthless without skilled hands to wield them. The work was different from her hospital experience in the East. Here, she dealt with the raw realities of frontier life. Injuries from wild animals, accidents with farming equipment, diseases that thrived in isolated communities with poor sanitation. Yet she found a satisfaction in this practice that had been missing from her previous position. These people came to her without pretense or social calculation. They needed healing and she could provide it. Samuel often assisted her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he held patients still or handed her instruments. He seemed to anticipate her needs, moving with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him as they worked together, noting the concentration in his dark eyes and the way his presence seemed to calm even the most frightened patients. It was during one such moment, as they treated a young woman who had been kicked by a horse, that Eleanor became aware of something shifting between them. Their hands brushed as she reached for a bandage, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her entire body. When she looked up, she found Samuel watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. As winter began to soften into early spring, I find myself curious about the changing seasons where you are. Whether you're watching snow melt or flowers bloom, or perhaps experiencing an entirely different season altogether, I'd love to know what time of day it is in your corner of the world and what signs of change you might be seeing outside your window right now. The moment passed when their patient moaned softly, drawing their attention back to her care. But something had been acknowledged between them, a recognition that their partnership extended beyond the professional. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn as she focused on her work, aware of Samuel's presence in an entirely new way. Their evenings began to take on a different quality. After Mrs. Henderson retired to her quarters and the house settled into quiet, Eleanor and Samuel would sit by the fire discussing the day's patients and medical challenges. These conversations gradually expanded to encompass books, philosophy, and their respective pasts. Eleanor learned that Samuel had built his empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and genuine care for the people who worked for him. He had started as a ranch hand himself, he told her one evening as they sat before the crackling hearth. Saved every penny, learned everything he could about cattle and land management, and eventually scraped together enough money to buy a small spread. The empire had grown from there, built on principles of fair dealing and treating employees like family rather than hired help. "What about your family?" Eleanor asked, curious about the man who had shown her such kindness. "Do you have people back east?" Samuel's expression grew distant. "Parents died when I was young," he said quietly. "No siblings, no wife. This ranch and the people on it, they're my family now. Mrs. Henderson, the cowboys, even the cattle in some ways. It's not the life I imagined as a boy, but it's a good life." Eleanor heard the loneliness beneath his words, recognizing it because it echoed her own. They were both people who had built lives around purpose and work, finding meaning in caring for others while remaining essentially alone. The recognition created a bond between them that felt both comfortable and dangerous. As her reputation grew, so did the challenges to it. Not everyone in the territory welcomed an Eastern woman practicing medicine without official credentials. Dr. Whitman, the elderly physician who served the territorial capital, made the 3-day journey to Samuel's ranch specifically to confront what he called the pretender who was undermining proper medical practice. Eleanor received him in the parlor that had become her clinic, acutely aware that this confrontation could end everything she had begun to build. Dr. Whitman was a stern man in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of rigid bearing that spoke of absolute certainty in his own authority. He examined her makeshift medical office with obvious disapproval. "Young woman," he began, his voice carrying the weight of professional indignation. "I understand you've been practicing medicine without proper licensing or oversight. This is highly irregular and potentially dangerous to the people of this territory." Eleanor straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of dignity she had thought exhausted by her Boston ordeal. "I'm a trained nurse, Dr. Whitman," she replied evenly. "I treat injuries and illnesses within my scope of practice. I don't perform surgery or claim to be a physician." Dr. Whitman snorted dismissively. "Scope of practice," he repeated. "You're treating patients without supervision, making diagnoses, prescribing treatments. In civilized society, such activities require proper credentials and male oversight. The words stung because they echoed the accusations that had destroyed her Boston career. But this time, Eleanor felt something different rising within her. Not shame, but anger. She thought of Danny Henderson, alive because of her skills, of the pregnant woman whose complications she had managed, of the dozen other patients who had found relief through her care. In civilized society, she said, her voice growing stronger, patients don't have to ride 3 days to see a doctor. They don't die from treatable conditions because help is too far away. I may not have a territorial license, Dr. Whitman, but I have something more important. Results. Before Dr. Whitman could respond, Samuel appeared in the doorway. His presence seemed to fill the room, and Eleanor saw something in his expression she had never witnessed before. Cold anger tightly controlled but unmistakably present. He looked at Dr. Whitman with the kind of assessment usually reserved for dangerous animals. Doctor, Samuel said, his voice deceptively mild, I believe you're questioning the medical care being provided on my property. Care that has saved lives and improved the health of this entire region. I'm curious about your concerns. Dr. Whitman seemed to deflate slightly under Samuel's steady gaze. The older man clearly recognized that he was facing someone with significant influence and resources, someone not easily intimidated by appeals to authority or tradition. The confrontation that had seemed so threatening moments before now felt manageable, with Samuel's solid presence backing her position. Eleanor realized in that moment that she was no longer fighting her battles alone. For the first time since Boston, she had someone willing to stand beside her, someone who valued her abilities over the opinions of distant authorities. The knowledge filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth and everything to do with the man who had chosen to defend her. The confrontation with Dr. Whitman marked a turning point in Eleanor's relationship with the territory's established medical authority, but it also brought unwanted attention from other quarters. Word reached the territorial capital that an unlicensed woman was practicing medicine under the protection of Samuel Cartwright, one of the region's wealthiest and most influential ranchers. Letters began arriving at the ranch, some supportive but others threatening legal action if Eleanor continued her work. Samuel read these correspondence with growing irritation, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the petty politics and professional jealousy disguised as concern for public welfare. He found Eleanor in her makeshift clinic one morning, treating a minor's infected hand with the careful attention that had become her trademark. The man was rough and weathered, his clothes bearing the permanent stains of his dangerous profession, but Eleanor spoke to him with the same courtesy she would have shown a Boston socialite. When the minor left, grateful and already showing signs of improvement, Samuel closed the clinic door and turned to face Eleanor. His expression was serious, and she felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. Had he finally decided that harboring an unlicensed medical practitioner was too much trouble for his reputation and business interests? We need to talk, Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. These letters from the territorial authorities are becoming more threatening. They're talking about sending marshals to investigate your practice, possibly charging you with practicing medicine without a license. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her shoulders. Just when she had begun to believe she might have found a place where her skills mattered more than her credentials, the same forces that had destroyed her Boston career were reaching out to drag her down again. She sank into a chair, her hands folding in her lap with the resigned grace of someone accustomed to defeat. I understand, she said quietly. I'll stop seeing patients immediately. I won't bring trouble to your door after everything you've done for me. Perhaps it's time I moved on, found somewhere else to start over. Samuel moved to stand before her, his presence commanding her attention. When she looked up, she was surprised by the intensity in his dark eyes. There was no resignation there, no acceptance of defeat. Instead, she saw the same determined strength that had built an empire from nothing. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly, and you're not stopping your medical practice. What you're doing here is too important, saving too many lives. If the territorial authorities want to make this a legal battle, then we'll give them one they won't forget. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. The idea that someone would fight for her, would risk their own standing to protect her right to practice medicine, seemed almost too wonderful to believe. In Boston, even her closest colleagues had abandoned her when the scandal broke, protecting their own careers by distancing themselves from her supposed disgrace. Samuel, she began, her voice unsteady with emotion. You don't understand what you're risking. These people have the power to destroy reputations, to make life impossible for anyone who opposes them. I've seen what they can do. Samuel knelt beside her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. His hand covered hers with gentle strength, and she felt the calluses earned through years of hard work. Let me tell you something about power, Eleanor, he said. Real power doesn't come from titles or territorial appointments. It comes from being indispensable to the people around you. You've made yourself indispensable to this community through your skill and dedication. That gives you a kind of strength these bureaucrats can't touch. His words ignited something within her that had been dormant since Boston. She remembered why she had become a nurse in the first place. The satisfaction of healing and the joy of using her abilities to improve lives. The scandal had made her forget that her value lay not in society's approval, but in her own competence and compassion. What do you propose we do? She asked, her voice growing stronger. Samuel smiled, and she saw the calculating intelligence that had built his business empire. First, we're going to document everything you've done since arriving here. Every patient treated, every successful outcome, every life saved. We'll gather testimonials from the people you've helped and their families. Then we're going to take this fight to them instead of waiting for them to come to us. The plan Samuel outlined was audacious in its scope. He intended to petition the territorial government directly, presenting Eleanor's case not as a request for mercy, but as evidence that the current system was failing the people it was supposed to serve. He would use his wealth and influence to ensure the petition received serious consideration, while simultaneously organizing community support for Eleanor's continued practice. Over the following weeks, Eleanor watched in amazement as Samuel transformed what should have been her personal crisis into a territory-wide movement for medical reform. Patients she had treated rode long distances to provide written testimonials. Ranch hands who had witnessed her emergency surgery on Danny Henderson signed statements describing her skill and professionalism. Even some of the local business owners, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, added their voices to the growing chorus of support. The work brought Eleanor and Samuel closer together in ways that had nothing to do with medical emergencies or business discussions. They spent long evenings in his study, drafting letters and organizing documentation, their heads bent together over legal documents and medical records. Sometimes their hands would brush as they reached for the same paper, or their eyes would meet across the desk, and Eleanor would feel that same electric awareness that had surprised her weeks earlier. During one such evening, as spring rain drummed against the study windows and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, Samuel looked up from a letter he was writing to find Eleanor watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also something deeper and more complex. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. Why risk your reputation and resources for someone you barely know? You could simply send me away and avoid all this trouble. Samuel set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. Because you don't deserve what happened to you in Boston, he said simply. Because this territory needs good medical care more than it needs bureaucratic protocol. And because, he paused, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't come easily. Eleanor waited, her heart beating faster as she sensed they were approaching something that would change everything between them. Because I've never met anyone like you, he finished quietly. Your strength, your dedication to helping people despite everything you've endured, the way you've brought purpose and meaning to this place. You've changed my life, Eleanor, in ways I'm still trying to understand. The admission hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to explore fully. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of wonder rather than sorrow. For so long, she had seen herself only through the lens of her failures and scandals. To hear Samuel speak of her with such respect and admiration felt like discovering she possessed a value she had forgotten existed. Before either could say more, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway with a tea tray, breaking the spell that had settled over the room. But as Eleanor helped organize the documents they had been working on, she was acutely aware of every movement Samuel made, every glance he sent in her direction. Something fundamental had shifted between them, and she knew there would be no going back to the comfortable distance they had maintained before. The territorial hearing was scheduled for the first week of May, giving Eleanor and Samuel barely a month to prepare their case. Samuel hired the best lawyer in the territory, a sharp-minded man named Harrison Blake who specialized in challenging bureaucratic overreach. Blake arrived at the ranch with boxes of legal precedents and a confidence that both impressed and intimidated Eleanor. As they worked to build her defense, Eleanor found herself caught between hope and terror. The rational part of her mind understood that Samuel's wealth and influence gave them significant advantages. But her heart remembered too clearly how quickly powerful people had turned against her in Boston. She had learned not to trust in justice or fairness when personal interests were at stake. The preparation sessions revealed new depths to Samuel's character. He demonstrated a legal mind that matched his business acumen, asking probing questions and identifying weaknesses in their opponents' likely arguments. Eleanor watched him transform from the gentle man who assisted her with patience into something approaching a warrior, fierce in his determination to protect what he valued. During a particularly intense strategy session, Blake posed the question that had been haunting Eleanor since the hearing was announced. "Miss Morrison," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "you must understand that they will attempt to discredit you personally. The Boston scandal will certainly be brought up, along with questions about your moral character and fitness to practice medicine. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Eleanor felt her courage falter momentarily. The thought of having her past dissected in public, of facing the same accusations that had driven her from everything she had known, filled her with dread. But when she looked at Samuel, she saw only steady support and unshakable confidence in her worth. "I'm prepared," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What happened in Boston was not my fault, and I won't let fear of gossip and lies prevent me from helping people who need medical care." Samuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture both comforting and somehow claiming. "She's one of the finest medical practitioners I've ever witnessed," he told Blake. "Her skills saved Danny Henderson's life, and she successfully treated dozens of other patients since then. Personal attacks are all they have because they can't challenge her professional competence." The lawyer nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the position we'll take. We're not here to defend Miss Morrison's past. We're here to demonstrate her present value to this community and this territory. As they gather evidence and testimonials from across this vast territory, I can't help but wonder about the communities you're part of. Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet town, somewhere in between day and night, I'm curious where in the world you're listening from and what kind of community surrounds you in your corner of the globe." The weeks leading up to the hearing brought unexpected revelations about the depth of support Eleanor had earned. Patients traveled from remote corners of the territory to offer testimony, some riding for days to reach the territorial capital. Samuel organized their transportation and lodging, turning Eleanor's legal defense into something resembling a medical convention. Mrs. Patterson, the rancher's wife whose difficult pregnancy Eleanor had managed, arrived with her healthy baby and a determination to speak publicly about the care she had received. Tom Henderson brought his son Danny, fully recovered and eager to show the scars that proved Eleanor's skill. Even old Jeremiah Walsh, the prospector whose persistent cough had turned out to be tuberculosis, made the journey despite his weakened condition. The night before they were to leave for the territorial capital, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She slipped from her room and made her way to the parlor that had served as her clinic, running her fingers over the instruments Samuel had purchased and the medical books he had acquired for her use. This room had become the center of her new life, the place where she had rediscovered her purpose and value. Samuel found her there, standing by the window and looking out at the star-filled sky. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without quite touching. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with shared understanding rather than uncertainty. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of losing the hearing. I'm afraid of losing this, of losing the life we've built here, the work that matters, the feeling of belonging somewhere." Samuel turned to face her, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, his expression was tender and determined. "You're not going to lose anything," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you have a place here for as long as you want it. You've made yourself indispensable, not just as a medical practitioner but as—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words that carried more weight than either was ready to examine fully. "As someone who matters to me," he finished quietly. "Someone I can't imagine this ranch, this life, without." Eleanor felt her breath catch at the raw honesty in his voice. The careful distance they had maintained, the professional boundaries that had made their growing closeness seem safe, dissolved completely in that moment. She saw in his eyes the same longing that had been building within her own heart, the recognition that what lay between them had grown far beyond gratitude or convenience. "Samuel," she whispered, his name carrying all the emotions she couldn't yet put into words. He stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her face with infinite gentleness. For a moment, they stood suspended between friendship and something deeper, both aware that crossing this threshold would change everything. Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling safer and more valued than she had since childhood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment, and they stepped apart as urgent voices called from the yard. Samuel moved swiftly to the door, Eleanor following, both recognizing the signs of emergency that had become familiar over the past months. A rider from the neighboring ranch burst into the parlor, his face flushed with exertion and worry. "Miss Morrison," he gasped, "it's my wife. The baby's coming, but something's wrong. She's been laboring for hours and the midwife says we need to prepare for the worst." Eleanor felt her medical training surge forward, pushing aside the emotional turmoil of moments before. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, already moving toward her medical bag. 6 miles south, the man replied. "But Miss Morrison, if you come tonight, you'll miss your hearing tomorrow. If you're not there to defend yourself." Eleanor paused, the implications hitting her with painful clarity. If she left now to attend a difficult birth, she would forfeit her chance to defend her right to practice medicine in the territory. Yet if she stayed, a woman and her unborn child might die for lack of proper medical care. Samuel stepped forward, his decision already made. "We'll ride together," he told Eleanor. "I'll get you there and back in time for the hearing, even if I have to carry you to the courthouse myself." Eleanor looked at him with wonder and gratitude. Once again, he was choosing to support her without question, even when doing so meant risking everything they had worked to build. In that moment, she realized that what she felt for Samuel Cartwright had moved far beyond gratitude or partnership. She was falling in love with a man whose strength matched her own, whose values aligned with hers so perfectly it seemed like destiny rather than chance. Together, they rode into the night toward another crisis, another test of Eleanor's skills, and another opportunity for Samuel to demonstrate the unwavering support that was becoming the foundation of something neither quite dared to name. The ride through the darkness tested both Eleanor's horsemanship and her resolve. Samuel led the way across terrain made treacherous by spring rains, his sure knowledge of the land guiding them safely through creek beds swollen with snowmelt and around rocky outcroppings that could cripple a horse in the darkness. Eleanor followed, her medical bag secured across her saddle, her mind already focused on the challenges that awaited them. They reached the Hendricks Ranch as dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to promise hope despite the crisis within the modest farmhouse. Samuel helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary, and she drew strength from his touch before hurrying toward the sounds of distress coming from within. What Eleanor found tested every skill she had acquired during her medical training. Margaret Hendricks was a small woman attempting to deliver what was clearly a large baby, and the prolonged labor had exhausted both mother and child. The local midwife, an elderly woman with kind eyes and limited experience, stepped back gratefully as Eleanor took charge of the situation. The baby was breeched, Eleanor realized after a careful examination, positioned feet first in a way that made natural delivery extremely dangerous for both mother and child. In a hospital setting, this would have been a clear case for surgical intervention, but here in a remote farmhouse with primitive facilities, Eleanor would have to attempt a manual rotation that required precise timing and considerable risk. Samuel appeared at her shoulder, having quietly entered the room after ensuring the anxious father was occupied elsewhere. "What do you need?" he asked simply, his presence immediately calming the charged atmosphere. "Clean water, towels, and someone to hold the lamp steady," Eleanor replied, her voice taking on the calm authority that characterized her medical work. "This is going to be difficult, and I'll need perfect light to see what I'm doing." The next hour stretched like an eternity as Eleanor worked with infinite patience to reposition the unborn child. Margaret Hendricks bore the procedure with remarkable courage, following Eleanor's instructions despite her exhaustion and pain. Samuel held the lamp with unwavering steadiness, his free hand occasionally offering silent support when Eleanor's concentration threatened to waver. Finally, with the expertise born of years of training and months of frontier practice, Eleanor successfully turned the baby into the proper position for delivery. Within minutes, the child emerged healthy and vigorous, filling the farmhouse with the strong cries that announced successful birth. Margaret Hendricks wept with relief and joy as Eleanor placed her son in her arms, the ordeal finally over. The sun was fully risen by the time Eleanor finished her post-delivery care, ensuring that both mother and child were stable and comfortable. The territorial hearing was scheduled to begin in 3 hours, and they faced a hard ride back to town if Eleanor was to appear in her own defense. Yet as she looked down at the healthy baby she had helped bring safely into the world, she felt no regret for her choice. Samuel found her on the farmhouse porch, where she stood breathing the cool morning air and letting the tension of the night's work drain from her shoulders. His expression was one of quiet admiration mixed with concern for the challenge that still lay ahead of them. "We should leave soon if we're going to make the hearing," he said gently. "Are you ready for this?" Eleanor turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that had not been there before. The uncertainty and fear that had characterized her arrival at his ranch months ago were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth. The night's successful delivery had reminded her of why she had become a nurse, of the irreplaceable value of her skills and dedication. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Whatever they say about me, whatever accusations they make, I know who I am now. I'm someone who saves lives, who makes a difference. They can't take that away from me with their politics and bureaucracy." Samuel felt his chest tighten with an emotion that went far beyond admiration. This was the woman he had glimpsed during Danny Henderson's emergency surgery, the skilled professional who had been buried beneath months of self-doubt and shame. Her strength and purpose shone like beacon, and he realized that what he felt for her had grown into something that would reshape his entire life. The ride back to town was accomplished in record time, Samuel pushing the pace while ensuring Eleanor arrived in condition to present her case effectively. They reached the courthouse with barely minutes to spare, Eleanor's traveling dress dusty from the road, but her bearing dignified and professional. Harrison Blake met them at the courthouse steps, his expression relieved but concerned. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "The hearing was nearly postponed when you didn't appear on time." "Delivering a baby," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "Mother and child are both healthy and doing well." Blake stared at her in amazement, then began to smile. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect. You've just provided us with the most powerful argument we could possibly have." The hearing room was packed with spectators, some supportive but others clearly hostile to Eleanor's cause. She recognized several faces from the community that had embraced her medical practice, but also saw the stern disapproval of established medical authorities who viewed her as a dangerous precedent. Dr. Whitman sat with the territorial officials, his expression smugly confident. Beside him was a younger man Eleanor didn't recognize, well-dressed and bearing himself with the kind of arrogance that suggested important connections. Samuel's hand briefly touched her shoulder as they took their seats, a gesture of support that steadied her nerves. The Territorial Medical Board chairman, a portly man with thinning hair and the soft look of someone who had spent his career in administrative positions rather than treating patients, called the hearing to order. "Miss Eleanor Morrison," he began, his tone suggesting he had already reached his conclusions. "You stand accused of practicing medicine without proper territorial licensing, endangering public health through unqualified treatment, and undermining the established medical authority of this territory." Eleanor rose to respond, her voice clear and steady despite the weight of the accusations. "I stand before you as a trained nurse who has used her skills to save lives and improve the health of this community. Every patient I have treated has received competent, compassionate care. I have never claimed to be a physician, but I have provided medical services in situations where no physician was available." The younger man beside Dr. Whitman leaned forward, his eyes cold with professional jealousy. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the kind of educated authority that Eleanor recognized from her Boston days, "I am Dr. James Crawford, recently appointed as Territorial Medical Supervisor. I have reviewed reports of your activities, and I find them deeply troubling. You have performed procedures clearly beyond the scope of nursing practice, made medical diagnoses, and prescribed treatments without physician oversight." Eleanor felt the familiar chill of bureaucratic attack, but this time she was not alone. Samuel sat behind her, his presence a source of strength, and around the room were faces of people whose lives she had touched through her medical care. Whatever happened here, she had already proven her worth where it mattered most. Dr. Crawford continued his attack with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to destroying careers through procedural challenges. Yet Eleanor found herself listening with detachment rather than the crushing despair she had experienced in Boston. She had learned something important during her months in Samuel's territory. Her value as a healer was not determined by the opinions of men like Crawford, but by the patients who lived because of her skill and dedication. When Crawford finished his litany of accusations, Eleanor rose to respond. She looked around the packed hearing room, seeing the faces of people she had treated, lives she had saved, families she had helped through medical crises. In that moment, she realized that this hearing was not really about her credentials or territorial authority. It was about whether bureaucratic procedure mattered more than human lives, whether political power could override practical results. Eleanor stood before the packed hearing room, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The morning's successful delivery had reminded her of her true calling, and now she faced the men who would decide whether she could continue answering that call. Dr. Crawford sat with his arms crossed, confident in his bureaucratic authority, while the territorial board members shuffled papers and avoided direct eye contact. "Gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "you speak of credentials and territorial authority as if they were more important than human lives. Last night, while you slept in your comfortable beds, I delivered a healthy baby to a woman who would have died without skilled intervention. This morning, Margaret Hendricks holds her son because someone with medical training was available when she needed help most." Dr. Crawford interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Miss Morrison, your emotional appeals cannot disguise the fundamental issue here. You lack proper licensing, you practice without physician oversight, and you have no legal authority to provide medical care in this territory." Eleanor felt a familiar flash of the anger that had sustained her through months of rebuilding her life. She thought of Danny Henderson, alive because she had sutured his wounds with steady hands, of the pregnant women who had received proper prenatal care, the children whose fevers she had broken, the countless small emergencies she had handled with skill and compassion. "Dr. Crawford," she replied, her voice growing stronger, "I have something more valuable than your territorial licenses. I have results. I have patients who are alive and healthy because they received competent medical care when they needed it most. Can your bureaucratic procedures save lives? Can your official stamps heal wounds or deliver babies?" Harrison Blake rose smoothly, recognizing his moment to present their carefully prepared defense. "Members of the board," he said, his voice resonating with legal authority, "we have gathered extensive testimony about Miss Morrison's medical practice. I would like to call our first witness." Tom Henderson took the stand with obvious nervousness, his weathered hands gripping his hat as he faced the intimidating panel of officials. He spoke simply but powerfully about the night his son Danny had been gored by a bull, how Eleanor's skill had saved the boy's life when death seemed certain. His testimony was followed by Margaret Patterson, still weak from childbirth but determined to speak about the prenatal care that had prevented potentially fatal complications. One by one, Eleanor's patients told their stories. The old prospector whose tuberculosis she had diagnosed and treated. The ranch wife whose infected wound had healed under Eleanor's careful attention. The child whose broken arm she had set with such skill that no permanent damage remained. Each testimony painted a picture of competent, compassionate medical care provided by someone who truly understood her profession. Samuel watched Eleanor's face as the testimonies unfolded, seeing the quiet pride and growing confidence that replaced the uncertainty she had carried for so long. This was who she truly was beneath the scandal and self-doubt. A healer whose dedication to her patients transcended politics and bureaucracy. He felt his love for her deepen with each story of lives saved and suffering relieved. Dr. Crawford grew visibly agitated as the testimonies mounted, clearly recognizing that his bureaucratic arguments were being overwhelmed by practical results. When Blake finished presenting their witnesses, Crawford rose with the desperate energy of someone watching his position crumble. "These testimonials are irrelevant," he declared, his voice rising with frustration. "Miss Morrison may have achieved some positive outcomes, but she has violated territorial law and established medical protocol. If we allow unlicensed practitioners to operate without oversight, we open the door to quackery and dangerous incompetence." The board chairman seemed uncertain, glancing between Crawford's legal arguments and the compelling testimony they had just heard. It was clear that the hearing could go either way, depending on whether bureaucratic procedure or practical results carried more weight with the decision-makers. Samuel rose from his seat, his movement commanding immediate attention throughout the room. His presence seemed to fill the space, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the protective determination in his expression. She had not expected him to speak, but clearly he had reached some internal decision that would not be deterred. "Chairman Williams," Samuel said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected, "I request permission to address this board as a concerned citizen and employer of Miss Morrison's services." The chairman nodded nervously, clearly recognizing Samuel's influence and wealth. "Of course, Mr. Cartwright." The board values your perspective on this matter. Samuel moved to stand beside Eleanor, his solidarity with her position unmistakable to everyone in the room. Gentlemen, he began, his voice steady and confident, you are debating the fate of the finest medical practitioner this territory has ever seen. Miss Morrison has saved more lives in 6 months than some licensed physicians manage in entire careers. She has brought modern medical knowledge to communities that desperately needed skilled care. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing with increased intensity. Dr. Crawford speaks of protocol and authority, but I ask you to consider practical realities. This territory covers thousands of square miles with a handful of licensed physicians scattered across vast distances. When someone is injured or ill in remote areas, they cannot wait days for official help to arrive. They need immediate, competent care from someone who knows what they are doing. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as Samuel continued his defense of her work. His support went far beyond professional courtesy or business necessity. This was a man fighting for someone he valued, someone whose contributions he refused to see diminished by bureaucratic narrow-mindedness. Samuel's voice grew more personal as he concluded his statement. Miss Morrison represents everything this territory needs: skill, dedication, courage, and genuine care for human welfare. If you silence her voice and stop her practice, you will be denying medical care to people who have no other options. You will be choosing bureaucratic convenience over human lives. The hearing room fell silent as Samuel returned to his seat, his words hanging in the air like a challenge to the board's conscience. Eleanor looked at him with wonder and gratitude, seeing in his steadfast support something she had never experienced before: unconditional belief in her worth and abilities. Dr. Crawford made one final attempt to sway the board, citing territorial statutes and medical regulations with increasing desperation. But Eleanor could see in the board members' faces that Samuel's practical arguments and the patient's testimonies had shifted the balance decisively in her favor. Chairman Williams called for a brief recess to allow the board to deliberate, and Eleanor found herself alone with Samuel in the courthouse hallway. The noise and pressure of the hearing room faded away, leaving them in a bubble of quiet intimacy that felt both precious and fragile. Thank you, Eleanor said simply, the words carrying depths of meaning that encompassed everything he had done for her since that first night at the train station. Samuel took her hands in his touch warm and steady despite the tension of the moment. Eleanor, he said quietly, what I said in there about your value to this territory, about your skill and dedication, that's only part of the truth. She looked up at him questioningly, seeing something in his dark eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. The whole truth, Samuel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears, is that you've become essential to my life in ways that have nothing to do with medicine or territorial politics. You've brought light and purpose to my world, and I can't imagine facing any future that doesn't include you. Before Eleanor could respond, the courthouse door opened and Blake emerged to summon them back for the board's decision. But as they returned to face whatever verdict awaited them, Eleanor carried Samuel's words in her heart like a talisman against whatever challenges lay ahead. The silence in the hearing room stretched like a held breath as Chairman Williams shuffled through the papers before him. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, outwardly calm but inwardly trembling with the knowledge that these next few moments would determine not just her professional future, but her ability to remain in the territory that had become her sanctuary. Samuel's presence beside her was both comforting and intensifying. His whispered declaration had added a layer of emotional complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Chairman Williams cleared his throat and looked directly at Eleanor, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Miss Morrison, he began, his voice carrying formal authority, this board has carefully considered the evidence presented today, including both the accusations against you and the testimony supporting your medical practice. Dr. Crawford leaned forward in his chair, confident that bureaucratic protocol would ultimately prevail over emotional appeals. Eleanor could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the assumption that his official authority would triumph over her practical results. But something in Chairman Williams' tone suggested the decision might not be as straightforward as Crawford expected. The board acknowledges, Williams continued, that you have been practicing medicine without proper territorial licensing. This is a serious violation of established law and medical protocol. However, we also acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances of your practice and the undeniable evidence of lives saved through your intervention. Eleanor felt her heart sink at the formal acknowledgement of her violation, but she forced herself to remain steady. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity. Samuel's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of support that gave her strength. After considerable deliberation, Williams announced, "This board has reached a unanimous decision. We hereby grant Miss Eleanor Morrison provisional licensing to practice nursing and emergency medicine within this territory, subject to periodic review and oversight by territorial medical authorities." The hearing room erupted in cheers and applause from Eleanor's supporters, while Dr. Crawford's face flushed with anger and disbelief. Eleanor sat stunned, unable to immediately process that she had not only avoided punishment, but had actually won official recognition of her right to practice medicine. The months of fear and uncertainty dissolved in an instant, replaced by a joy so intense it felt almost overwhelming. Samuel's grip on her hand tightened, and when she turned to look at him, she saw pride and happiness shining in his dark eyes. They had fought this battle together, and their victory felt like the beginning of something far more significant than professional vindication. Chairman Williams raised his hand for silence, his expression stern despite the favorable ruling. "This decision," he continued, "comes with specific conditions. Miss Morrison will establish a formal medical practice under territorial oversight, maintain detailed records of all treatments provided, and submit to periodic reviews of her methods and outcomes. She will also work in cooperation with licensed physicians whenever possible, consulting on complex cases and referring patients when appropriate." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, her voice trembling with emotion as she addressed the board. "Thank you," she said simply. "I promise to uphold the highest standards of medical care and to serve this territory with the same dedication I have shown since my arrival." As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel guided Eleanor from the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. The world seemed transformed by their victory, more vivid and full of possibility than it had appeared just hours before. Eleanor felt as if she had been reborn, freed from the shame and uncertainty that had haunted her since Boston. "We did it," Samuel said quietly, his voice filled with wonder at what they had accomplished together. "You can practice medicine legally now without fear or hiding. You can build the kind of medical practice this territory truly needs." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing not just satisfaction over their legal victory, but something deeper and more personal. The man who had rescued her from a frozen train station had become so much more than her savior. He had become her partner, her champion, and now, perhaps, something even more precious. "Samuel," she began, her voice soft with emotion, "what you said before the hearing, about me being essential to your life. Did you mean it?" His answer came without hesitation, his hands rising to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "Every word," he said. "Eleanor, these past months watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and dedication, witnessing the way you bring healing and hope wherever you go. You've changed everything for me. You've made me understand what it means to truly care for someone, to want their happiness more than your own." The words Eleanor had been guarding in her heart for weeks finally found their voice. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I never thought I could trust anyone enough to feel this way again, but you've shown me what it means to be truly supported and valued." Samuel's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, there on the courthouse steps with half the territory watching. Their kiss was gentle but filled with promise, the public declaration of feelings that had been building between them for months. Eleanor felt the last walls around her heart crumble, replaced by a trust and love she had never imagined possible. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor became aware of the crowd that had gathered to witness their embrace. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, while Tom Henderson and his son Danny grinned with obvious approval. Even some of the territorial officials seemed moved by the romantic conclusion to the day's dramatic events. Harrison Blake approached them with a broad smile and a sheaf of legal documents. "Congratulations on both counts," he said warmly. "Your territorial license will be official within the week, Miss Morrison. And might I suggest that you consider establishing your practice in a more permanent location? Perhaps something that would accommodate both medical services and, eventually, a family?" Eleanor felt her cheeks burn at the lawyer's obvious suggestion, but Samuel's arm tightened around her waist in a gesture that suggested Blake's assumptions might not be far from the truth. The future that had seemed so uncertain that morning now stretched before them, filled with possibility and promise. As we witness this moment of triumph and new beginnings in this frontier territory, I find myself wondering about new beginnings in your own life. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, or deep into the night, I'm curious about what hopes and dreams you might be nurturing, what victories you're celebrating, or what challenges you're facing with courage and determination. The ride back to Samuel's ranch felt like a journey into a completely transformed world. Eleanor was no longer a refugee hiding from scandal but a licensed medical practitioner with official recognition and community support. More importantly, she was a woman in love with a man who had proven his devotion through actions rather than just words. As they approached the familiar buildings of the ranch, Eleanor realized that this place had become more than temporary shelter. Under Samuel's protection and with Mrs. Henderson's motherly care, she had found the home she had been searching for without knowing it. The thought of building a life here, of establishing a medical practice that could serve the territory for years to come, filled her with excitement rather than the fear that had characterized her arrival. Samuel helped her dismount in the ranch yard, his hands lingering at her waist as they stood together in the golden afternoon light. The crisis that had brought them together was over, replaced by the pleasant anticipation of planning a future that would honor both their individual strengths and their growing partnership. Eleanor looked around at the ranch that had sheltered her, the mountains that had witnessed her transformation, and the man whose love had made it all possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they could simply celebrate the victory they had won together and the love they had finally acknowledged. The future stretched before them like an uncharted territory, full of promise and possibility. 6 months after the territorial hearing, Eleanor stood in the doorway of her new medical clinic, watching the autumn sun cast golden light across the valley that had become her home. The building Samuel had constructed for her practice was everything she had dreamed of during her years in Boston's overcrowded hospitals. Spacious treatment rooms, modern equipment, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. Most importantly, it was hers, a place where she could practice medicine according to her own principles and training. The clinic had quickly become the medical center for the entire region, drawing patients from hundreds of miles away who sought Eleanor's reputation for skilled and compassionate care. She had hired 2 young women from back east to assist her, both trained nurses eager to escape the restrictions of urban hospital work. Together, they had created a practice that combined the latest medical knowledge with the practical needs of frontier life. Samuel appeared at her side, as he had countless times over the past months, his presence both comforting and exciting. Their relationship had deepened through shared work and mutual respect, growing from desperate attraction into something solid and enduring. He had become not just her protector and champion, but her partner in every sense that mattered. The afternoon brings its own patience, he observed, watching a wagon approach carrying what appeared to be a family seeking medical attention. You've built something remarkable here, Eleanor. Something that will serve this territory for generations. Eleanor leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural such gestures had become between them. The woman who had once feared trusting anyone with her emotional well-being now found Samuel's presence as essential as breathing. Their love had grown quietly but steadily, built on shared values and mutual support rather than passionate impulse. I couldn't have done any of this without you, she replied honestly. The clinic, the practice, even the confidence to believe I deserved this chance. You saw something in me that I had forgotten existed. Samuel's arm tightened around her waist, and she could feel the smile in his voice when he spoke. I saw what was always there, he said gently. I just helped clear away the obstacles so you could see it yourself. The approaching wagon contained the Morrison family from the eastern edge of the territory, their youngest child suffering from a persistent fever that had local remedies baffled. Eleanor welcomed them with the warm professionalism that had become her trademark, guiding them into the examination room while Samuel handled the practical details of their accommodation. As she worked with the sick child, Eleanor reflected on how much her practice had evolved since those early days of treating patients in Samuel's parlor. The official territorial license had given her credibility, but more importantly, it had given her the confidence to expand her services and take on more complex cases. She now performed minor surgeries, managed difficult pregnancies, and even collaborated with visiting physicians on cases that required specialized knowledge. The child's fever broke under Eleanor's careful treatment, and she sent the family to the boarding house Samuel had established specifically for patients who traveled long distances for medical care. The integration of medical services with accommodation and support had become a model that other territorial settlements were beginning to copy. Evening found Eleanor and Samuel in his study, now shared space where they planned both ranch operations and clinic expansion. Maps covered one wall, marking locations where additional medical services might be needed, while Eleanor's medical journals occupied an entire bookshelf alongside Samuel's business records. Samuel looked up from correspondence with territorial officials about funding for additional clinics, his expression thoughtful. Eleanor, he said carefully, I've been thinking about our future, about making our partnership official in ways that go beyond professional collaboration. Eleanor's heart quickened at the serious tone in his voice, recognizing the moment they had been approaching for months without directly addressing. Their relationship had grown so naturally from friendship to love that formal declarations had seemed unnecessary, but she understood that Samuel was a man who believed in making important commitments explicit and binding. Samuel rose from his desk and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with the same gentle strength he had shown since that first night at the train station. Eleanor Morrison, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his dark eyes. You have transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You've brought purpose and meaning to everything I do, made me understand what it truly means to love someone completely. Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes as she looked down at the man who had rescued her in every sense that mattered. The formal proposal she had been expecting seemed less important than the daily commitment they had already been living, but she understood his need to make their future official and permanent. Will you marry me? Samuel continued, his hands tightening around hers. Will you let me spend the rest of my life supporting your work, sharing your dreams, and building something together that will outlast both of us? Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. To marriage, to partnership, to building a life together that honors what we've both learned about love and commitment. Samuel's smile was radiant as he slipped a ring onto her finger. A simple band of gold set with a stone that caught the firelight like captured starlight. The ring felt right on her hand, a symbol of promises made and kept, of trust earned through actions rather than words. As they embraced in the warm light of the study, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scandal that had driven her from Boston, the desperate night at the train station, the months of rebuilding her professional life and learning to trust again. Every trial had been necessary to bring her to this place, to this man, to this future that felt both earned and blessed. Samuel pulled back to look at her face, his expression tender with the kind of love that came from truly knowing and accepting another person. We'll announce our engagement at the Harvest Festival next month, he said. Give the whole territory a chance to celebrate with us before we start planning the wedding. Eleanor nodded, already imagining the community that had embraced her gathering to witness the next chapter of her transformation. The same people who had testified on her behalf during the hearing would now celebrate her marriage to the man who had made it all possible. As they planned their future together, discussing everything from wedding details to clinic expansion, Eleanor felt a deep sense of completeness that had nothing to do with romantic fulfillment and everything to do with finding her true place in the world. She had discovered not just love, but purpose, community, and the kind of belonging that came from being valued for who she truly was rather than what others expected her to be. The fire crackled in the hearth as they talked late into the night, two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their own hearts. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the mountains that had witnessed Eleanor's transformation from desperate refugee to beloved healer, from broken woman to cherished partner. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve the territory they both loved. But tonight belonged to them and the future they would build together. Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger, then at the man who had placed it there, and felt the last shadows of her past finally disappear. She was no longer defined by scandal or shame, but by love, purpose, and the endless possibilities that stretched before them like the vast frontier sky. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Morrison became Eleanor Cartwright in a ceremony that brought together the entire territory to celebrate love born from crisis and nurtured through shared purpose. The small church Samuel had built in the growing town that now bore both their names was filled with patients she had healed, families she had delivered, and friends who had witnessed their journey from desperate rescue to enduring partnership. Eleanor stood at the window of their expanded ranch house, watching their 3-year-old daughter Sarah play in the garden, while their infant son slept peacefully in his cradle nearby. The children were living proof of the love that had transformed two solitary people into a family, but they were only part of the legacy Eleanor and Samuel had built together. The medical clinic had grown into a teaching hospital that attracted young doctors and nurses from across the country, eager to learn frontier medicine from the woman who had revolutionized territorial healthcare. Eleanor's methods, combining rigorous medical training with practical innovation, had become the standard for rural practice throughout the American West. Samuel appeared beside her, as he had countless times over the years, his presence still capable of making her heart quicken with love and gratitude. In his arms, he carried a letter bearing the official seal of the territorial government. his expression mixing pride with the kind of amazement that suggested extraordinary news. "Eleanor," he said softly, not wanting to wake the baby, "you need to see this. It's from the territorial capital, from the medical board." Eleanor took the letter with hands that had delivered hundreds of babies, sutured countless wounds, and saved more lives than she could count. The formal language of the document gave way to words that made her sit down heavily in the nearest chair. The territorial government was establishing the Eleanor Cartwright School of Nursing, the first institution of its kind west of the Mississippi River. The letter detailed how her innovations in frontier medicine had been documented and would now be taught to future generations of medical practitioners. Her techniques for emergency surgery, her protocols for managing difficult births, her methods for treating diseases common to frontier life, all would become part of formal medical education. Samuel knelt beside her chair, his voice filled with the wonder of someone witnessing history in the making. "They're naming the school after you, Eleanor. Your work, your dedication, everything you've built here, it's going to teach doctors and nurses for generations to come. You've literally changed the practice of medicine in the American West." Eleanor felt tears blur her vision as she looked around the room that had become the center of their life together. The walls were lined with medical texts and journals, correspondence from colleagues across the territory, and photographs of the hundreds of patients whose lives had been touched by her care. But more than professional recognition, she saw the evidence of personal happiness earned through trial and commitment. Their daughter Sarah ran into the room, her dark hair so like Samuel's flying behind her, as she climbed into Eleanor's lap with the confident expectation of welcome that spoke of unconditional love. "Mama," she announced with 3-year-old authority, "Mrs. Henderson says dinner is ready and Papa needs to stop reading grown-up letters." Eleanor laughed, the sound rich with contentment as she gathered her daughter close. Mrs. Henderson was right, as always. Some things were more important than even history-making correspondence, and family dinner was certainly one of them. As they made their way to the dining room, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect fulfillment. The woman who had nearly frozen to death at a remote train station, desperate and broken by scandal, could never have imagined this future. Yet every trial had been necessary, every challenge had strengthened her for the work and love that awaited. The dining room buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life as Mrs. Henderson, now more grandmother than housekeeper, fussed over the children while Samuel carved the roast with the same careful attention he brought to everything he did. The conversation flowed between ranch business, medical cases, and the daily details of raising children in a territory that was rapidly transforming from frontier wilderness into established civilization. After the children were settled for the night, Eleanor and Samuel retreated to their private sitting room, where a fire crackled warmly and their plans for the nursing school waited for discussion. But first, they simply sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their sanctuary, processing the magnitude of what the day had brought. Samuel reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their private language of love and support. "When I pulled you from that train station," he said quietly, "I thought I was simply saving a life. I had no idea I was rescuing the person who would transform not just my world, but the entire territory's approach to medical care." Eleanor squeezed his hand, thinking of all the ways he had rescued her beyond that first desperate night. He had given her space to heal, opportunity to rebuild her professional confidence, support to fight for her right to practice medicine, and love that had restored her faith in human goodness. As we reach the end of this story of transformation and love, I find myself thinking about the communities we build and the legacies we leave. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whether you're surrounded by family or finding your own path to belonging, I hope this tale reminds you that our greatest trials often lead to our most meaningful triumphs. The legacy they were building extended far beyond their own family or even the nursing school that would bear Eleanor's name. They had demonstrated that love could grow from crisis, that purpose could emerge from disaster, that two broken people could heal each other while healing countless others. Eleanor looked around their sitting room, seeing the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given. Samuel's business ledgers sat beside her medical journals. Their children's toys were scattered near serious correspondence about territorial medical policy, and photographs of patients, colleagues, and family created a visual history of transformation and growth. The school that would bear her name represented more than professional recognition. It embodied the principle that had guided her since that desperate night when Samuel found her. That healing was not just a technical skill but a calling that required courage, compassion, and the willingness to serve others regardless of personal cost. Years later, When historians would write about the development of medical care in the American West, they would document Eleanor Cartwright's innovations and Samuel's support for territorial healthcare development. But they would miss the most important part of the story: how two solitary people had found in each other the courage to build something greater than either could have achieved alone. Eleanor rose to check on their sleeping children one final time before retiring, a ritual that never failed to fill her with wonder at the life she had been blessed to build. Samuel followed, and together they stood in the nursery doorway, watching their son and daughter sleep peacefully in the security of unconditional love. "This is what we fought for," Eleanor whispered, her voice soft with reverence for the ordinary miracle of family safety and happiness. "This is what made all the struggle worthwhile." Samuel's arm encircled her waist as they returned to their own room, where moonlight streamed through windows that looked out over the territory they had helped shape. The ranch spread below them in peaceful prosperity. The town beyond showed lights and windows of families they had helped heal and protect, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle reminded them of journeys that led to unexpected destinations. As they prepared for sleep, Eleanor caught her reflection in the mirror that had witnessed years of transformation. The desperate woman who had fled Boston was gone completely, replaced by someone confident in her abilities and secure in her place in the world. But more than professional success or personal happiness, she saw in her own eyes the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived in service to others. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges in developing the nursing school, new opportunities to expand their medical services throughout the territory. But tonight, as Samuel's arms encircled her in the bed they had shared through years of building their life together, Eleanor felt the profound peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The story that had begun with desperate rescue at a frozen train station had become a legacy of healing, love, and service that would influence generations of medical practitioners and touch countless lives yet to come. Love had indeed made history, transforming not just two hearts but an entire territory's approach to caring for those in need.